Today I want to talk about Martha Morgan, a very imperfect heroine. She is very imperfect, as readers of the saga will know, and she's an extremely complicated character. I didn't have to create that complexity because it was all there when Martha came and spoke to me and visited me one dark night in Gran Canaria back in 1999. At the beginning of the saga, the 8-volume saga, Martha is a very insecure 18-year-old. She's pregnant, she's suicidal, she's been through a shotgun marriage to a man that she is still a little bit uncertain about. She thinks that she loves him, but she's not sure. But she's suffering from such a complete loss of self-esteem that she is on the point of throwing herself off a cliff on the mountain of Carningli and committing suicide. And she's stopped by a raven, thankfully. And the result of that is that we have a rather large and a large story and a long and adventurous life stretching ahead of us, which I've tried to portray through the 8 volumes of the Angel Mountain saga. At the end of the saga, Martha is a mature elderly woman, full of confidence. She's a matriarch, in fact, with a large extended family, sons, daughters, her own children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren scattered around all over the place at the end of a very long and exciting life. It's rather interesting that a Scottish friend of mine, when he started to read the saga, said, "Do you realize that you've actually created Mother Wales?" And I hadn't realized that at all. Nothing had been further from my mind. In fact, in writing the stories, I was simply concentrating on trying to portray the character as she had come to be. But I see what he means. I suppose that in the stories and in the character of Martha, we do have many of the features that are good and many of the features that are bad about Wales. I suppose that she herself can be used as some sort of symbol for what Wales is all about. The difficult thing for me as a writer, of course, in portraying Martha and in writing down her life story, was that at no point could I actually describe in the text what Martha was like, what she looked like even, because the story is told in Martha's own words. And that means that, and written in a diary, in fact. And in a diary, of course, you don't describe yourself, you don't describe your characteristics, your virtues and your vices. So these have to be left to the reader of this diary, this extended diary, to work out what it is about Martha that we can count as virtues and what it is about her that we can count as vices. So let's just talk initially then about Martha's virtues. She is, of course, very beautiful, very sexy. This is something that is remarked upon by many people. And she is also extremely, in some ways, she's a modern woman in that she's liberal, she's tolerant, she's rather free thinking, but she's also very compassionate. She's very loyal. She goes to extraordinary lengths to rescue her friends and her servants when they get into trouble. She's incredibly generous as well, in a time when generosity was in short supply, especially among the minor gentry. Martha makes sure that she doesn't borrow money in order to run the estate, because she's a single woman, a widow, in charge of an estate, trying to run it as best she can. She refuses to borrow money, but whenever she can, she lavishes generosity on her servants and her laborers. She gives them wages that are way above the wages that other gentry are paying to their laborers. And that, of course, is the cause of considerable anger and resentment on their part. And every Christmas, she organizes an enormous Christmas feast and takes great pride and great pleasure in doing that. And so her servants and her friends and her laborers are treated with great generosity and love and compassion by Martha. And that is why, of course, they turn into her angels. They will do anything to protect her when she is getting into trouble. She's quite unpretentious. She mixes much more easily with poor people than with rich people. And she's incredibly brave as well. She does things without any thought of her own personal safety. For example, she goes rushing off to the French invasion. When the French invade in 1797, she goes rushing off towards Fishguard to see whether, as a woman, she can do anything to help to defeat the French. She also has rather exaggerated ideas about her own ability to change the course of events. And so she goes off to Ireland thinking that she's going to do something about the Irish potato famine. And then she gets involved in other things as well, such as the Rebecca riots. She gets heavily involved in those, gets far too close to the action. And she even goes to the extent of wanting to take part in one of the riots herself, riding on a pony and joining the Rebecca rioters as they ride into considerable trouble. So she sails very close to the wind as far as her own safety is concerned, and she does have to be rescued time and time again. So she's very resilient, she's very anti-establishment, she's stubborn, and she's got this ability to bounce back time and time again from the troubles that she gets into. So one disaster after another follows her through her life. But no matter how many times she gets knocked down, she always seems to have the ability to get back up again. With, it has to be said, the help of her angels on many of these different occasions. She's also got a great thirst for knowledge. She wants to learn as much as she can about farming, estate management. She speaks 4 languages, and she takes great pleasure as well in beauty, in observing nature and in the stillness of nature. And she does manage to make time for herself to walk in the countryside, to sit and contemplate and enjoy the beauty of the environment that she finds herself in. So let's look at some of her vices as well. And there are many of these. Martha is a very imperfect heroine, as I said. She's got no respect for authority to start with, and that leads her into all sorts of trouble. She's quite impulsive, she's impetuous. In fact, you might classify her as being something of a busybody. She's completely incorrigible, and she's irrepressible as well. And she wants to get everything sorted. She cannot resist rushing off to sort out things wherever she sees evil or injustice or somebody who's suffering. She thinks that she needs to get over there and sort things out as quickly as possible. That doesn't mean to say she's a control freak. I don't think she is. She doesn't seek to organize or arrange things on behalf of everybody else, but she does find that her passion for justice is something that drives her into situations which inevitably will result in confrontations. She's somewhat erratic. She sometimes fails to see the collateral damage that she causes when she gets involved in these big causes. And so because of this inability to predict the consequences of her actions sometimes, she turns out not to be a very great mother, in fact. She sometimes neglects her own children without realizing it. And one of the great tragedies of Martha's life is that she loses contact with Daisy, her second daughter, simply because she neglects Daisy as a small child. Because a foundling appears on Martha's doorstep one day, and this is little Brunach, a small baby, who she finds on the doorstep and takes in and raises as her own child. And she's so besotted with this little baby that isn't actually her own child, that she loses contact with Daisy, and Daisy goes rushing off to London and stays away for a very long time without having any contact at all with her mother. And Martha doesn't predict that sort of thing. On other occasions, she fails to see the emotional turmoil that's going on in the lives of her family members and her servants. And she behaves rather uncaringly towards them occasionally because she doesn't realize what they happen to be going through. She's also got a bit of a tendency to become arrogant, and she's manipulative at times as well. She doesn't mind telling barefaced lies occasionally in order to get her way. And she takes a little bit too much pleasure in seeing down or facing down some of the pompous gentry and other gentlemen that she comes in contact with. So she quite enjoys getting the better of pompous men. And that is a feature that some of the rest of her family have to tick her off for on many different occasions. She doesn't always read what's going on, as I say, and in some situations she becomes a little bit paranoid. She's so preoccupied with her own feelings that she fails to notice what's going on around her, especially in the lives of her servants, as I said. So in some ways, she's actually a real tragic heroine. Her beauty is her blessing and her curse, in fact. And so she outlives the 5 great loves of her life, actually. There are 5 men who are in love with her, and each one of them dies before Martha does. So in that sense, she is a real tragic heroine. One of the features about her that I suppose we have to consider as a vice is her tendency to take pleasure in the defeat of her enemies. Her enemies do terrible things to her, it has to be said, and to her family. And her pursuit of justice leads her very often to enjoy a little bit too much bringing these men to justice. Some of them, after all, are hung from the gallows for the things that they have done. Others are sent off to the colonies in Australia as punishment. And this tendency towards vengefulness is something that Martha does worry about, and her friends and neighbours and servants worry about it as well, because they see it in her only too clearly. So she's a very complex figure, in fact, and whether we like her or loathe her, I suppose it's true that many of the readers of the novels have actually said that they would quite like to have been Martha Morgan. Actually, I'm not sure when they consider that statement in a little bit more detail, they would be quite sure of themselves, because Martha has a pretty terrible time of it. Some absolutely appalling things happen to her, and she does spend long periods of time in the novels in a very dark place. So this brings me just to a couple of points to round off this little mini portrayal of Martha. One of them is that her tendency to go into very, very deep depressions. And there are many occasions in the novels where she is seriously depressed. She encounters her black dog and has to live with this black dog. And sometimes she goes into such a deep depression that her friends and neighbors think that she's going to die. And she has a very long period of depression after she has a miscarriage. She loses her first child in a miscarriage. And she also goes into another very deep depression after her husband David is murdered. And various other depressions happen later in the story as well. And Joseph Harris, the wizard, her mentor, over and again has to try to drag her out of these depression episodes and get her back to her normal bouncy self again. And she does bounce back. And this has led me quite recently, actually, to realize that, again, this is quite unconscious on my part, but I think I've actually been portraying a person who suffers from bipolar disorder. And one of the characteristics of bipolar disorder, of course, is that there are wild extremes. People go into phases of complete euphoria, manic activity, positivity, and then they swing very quickly into phases of very, very deep depression, and it takes an age to drag them out of those episodes again. And another feature of bipolar disorder is, of course, psychosis. People do actually see things, and they experience things that we might call paranormal. And of course, it's a feature of Martha, and always was a feature of her character when it came to me originally, that Martha sees things like battles in the sky. She has her premonitions. And so she has a very, very interesting and complex mental state, which finds its way through to the surface in all of the stories. She learns to cope with her episodes of extreme hyperactivity and extreme misery as she swings from one extreme to the other. And she does manage to cope with those much better as she gets older. But she's a very complicated person. I love her dearly, of course, having written all this about her. And I've often been asked, where did Martha come from? I suppose Who knows? There's a lot of my wife in there, I suppose. There's a lot of my mother in there. I've got two sisters um, whom I lived with and learned quite a lot. Some very strong and lovely female friends. Maybe there are bits and pieces of all of their characters who are actually built into the personality of Martha Morgan.